Good morning, and welcome to our series, Healthy Aging. My name is Jim McBain. I'm a volunteer with OLLI, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's program. Up front, I'd like to recognize the planning committee and the programs that first helped to make the Healthy Aging series possible. These are the U of M Geriatric Department, Turner Senior Wellness Program, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, Silver Club Memory Programs, Turner African America Services Council, Institute for Healthcare Policy and Innovation, and the National Poll on Aging. Thank you all. Our topic today is losing the illusion of control and predictability of life, experiences of grief and loss during COVID-19. And our speakers are Dr. Jessica Finley and Tamara Stotts. I'll introduce our speakers in more detail in just a minute. First of all, a few words about our Zoom webinar. That's our platform that you're receiving this message on. And you are all probably quite familiar with it by now. But first of all, if you're having a problem with the sound, check your volume. You can just turn up your volume and you'll hear the speakers better. But if the problem is worse than that, exit the application and come back in again. And the invitation for this particular lecture was sent to you this morning by Jen Howard about 8 a.m. and the address for coming in is in that email. We also have a closed caption option if you wish to use that. Click on the CC icon and you can see the speaker's words running across the bottom of your screen, or you can also select a full transcript that will come up on the right of your screen. And the most important thing is to ask questions if you have them, and to do that, use the Q&A icon. Click on the Q&A, and a box will come up, and you can type your question in there, and the speakers will get to that at the end of the lecture. I do note that they're going to ask you a couple of times to put some input into the chat box if you wish, and feel free to do that. You'll see when that happens during their talk. But at the end, when we're asking questions, please put all your questions in the Q&A. Type on the Q&A icon and type in your question. I'd also like to call your attention to the next lecture in this series. On Friday, May 20th at 10 a.m., our lecture will be Grief, Coping, and Resilience in Aging, a Discussion. Please mark your calendars for that. Now to today's lecture. First, the legal disclaimer. The views expressed during the lecture and the Q&A do not necessarily reflect those of the University of Michigan. As usual, we'll have approximately 1 hour presentation followed by a 30-minute Q&A. Remember that Q&A icon. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Jessica Finley. She is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Social Environment and Health Program at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research. She is a health geographer, an environmental gerontologist with an MA and PhD in geography and gerontology from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Finley uses qualitative, geospatial, and mixed methods to investigate the role of built, social, natural, and microbial environments for health and well-being in later life. Her research focuses on how neighborhood environments may increase the risk for dementia or help buffer against cognitive decline. Dr. Finley also investigates psychosocial and behavioral impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the physical, mental, social, and cognitive health of aging adults. Our second speaker is Tamara Stotts, and she is an individual, marriage, and family therapist in Minnesota in private practice for the past 8 years. She works with aging adults and their families around concerns such as chronic and terminal illness, retirement, grief and loss, and family conflict. Tamara has experience working in many settings, including assisted living, hospice, in-home, and long-term care. In addition, Tamara has published research on the experiences of grief and guilt, among caregivers of individuals living with dementia, as well as grief experiences of aging adults in the COVID-19 pandemic. She is continuously honored to be a part of her clients' lives and support families during stressful and rewarding times of life. Dr. Finley, you're up first, so I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jim. It's such a pleasure to be here and speak with you all today. I know Tamara and I are both really excited for this presentation. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, I know there can be a delay sometimes. Tamara, can you see my slides?
I sure can.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so thank you again. As I said, it's really a pleasure to be here. And today, Tamara and I will be talking about experiences of grief and loss in our COVID-19 coping study responses. So this work has been done collaboratively. Jim already had a wonderful introduction for both me and Tamara on this slide. We also work very closely with Dr. Lindsay Kobayashi. She's an assistant professor in the Center for Social Epidemiology and Population Health, and also helps to co-lead the COVID-19 coping study with me over the past 2 years now. So just a little bit of background, when the COVID-19 pandemic was first beginning to kind of hit the United States in particular, Lindsay and I worked very closely together in our work on aging and cognitive health. And immediately we were thinking about impacts to our own lives and well-being, but also that of aging adults. And how might the pandemic have, both short and long-term impacts to the physical, mental, and social health and well-being of aging adults. And a lot of research kind of indicated early on that older adults may be particularly vulnerable to some of these short and long-term harms, given the increased risk for COVID-19 infection, as well as morbidity and mortality from the pandemic. But there was also a lot of indications that this may also be a really resilient age group. We know from previous work, for example, older adults in later life can be more resilient. There's some thoughts about, having wisdom and life experience and perspective, or more abilities to kind of buffer some of these harms that we all face. So we wanted to really explore that in depth to really understand the experiences of aging adults across the United States as the pandemic kind of went on. And today in particular, we're going to focus on the topic of grief. This is something, given kind of widespread morbidity and mortality in the pandemic, we know that many of us have felt losses of friends, family, and community members in our communities. But we also want to talk about how grief may extend to losses beyond death and bereavement, to include, for example, having to disrupt your whole life with canceling plans. Your daily routine now looks different. You may be separated from family and friends. I know, for example, much of my family lives in Canada and we were separated by an international border. So that is a loss that we navigated in our family. And also, of course, changes to the economic landscape, financial planning and circumstances, as well as unemployment. So in the slides that follow, we'll go into much more depth about how and why we're thinking about grief and loss and how it can extend much further than simply the loss of life of a loved one or a family or friend or community member. I'll briefly introduce the COVID-19 coping study. I know some of you may have been at the talk that Lindsay and I gave just last week, so I'll try and be medium brief, but still give enough for some of our new participants to learn about the study and how we came to collect our data. So this is a longitudinal mixed method study of adults aged at least 55 years old who are currently living in the United States. And this also includes all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia, and who were able to complete a baseline questionnaire in either English or Spanish. We did, at the beginning of the pandemic in about April and May of 2020, there were rapid changes happening what felt like every day to our lives, our political circumstances, what public health recommendations were. So we really wanted to capture a wide variety of people quickly and to potentially be in the study. So to do that, we posted ads on social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. We also emailed listservs, for example, through the Gerontological Society of America, through other professional organizations and aging community groups. We also put advertisements and talked to news media outlets such as radio and television to talk about the study and why we were hoping to hear about the perspectives of older Americans in this time. We used a couple research databases. These are where people sign up to be contacted to potentially volunteer to participate in studies. So we use NIH Research Match, as well as the University of Michigan's Health Research Platform. And we also used word of mouth. I think everyone in my life was tired of hearing about this study by the time May of 2020 hit. We basically asked everyone we knew to share it. I know Tamara was someone I reached out and said, hey, can you pass this along? And we tried to use word of mouth as well to get to broader networks of people who may not necessarily be as tapped into the local kind of networks that we were using. So we tried to kind of what we call snowball sample this. So like a growing snowball, pass it on to broader and broader communities of people across the states. We also thought, is anyone actually going to take this survey? Everyone is busy and stressed and confused. And so we also employed a professional survey company to survey, I believe it was 2,500 older adults age 55 plus with sampling and survey quota weights to match the US population for age, race, gender, ethnicity, and education. So that was a group that we knew we could pay to be volunteers in the study as well as kind of what we call our snowball sample that we recruited through these other channels. Lindsay and I were blown away. We had close to 7,000 people take part in the baseline study. So back in April and May of 2020, we had people across, actually, I think I have a map on the next slide. We had people across every state. So that includes all the continental United States, as well as Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. We had participants across the entire country participate in the study. So really great representation across our entire country to see some of these diverse experiences and how they might vary by the different places that we live and some of the local kind of connections, contexts, and supports that we have or don't have, depending upon where we live. And of course, given our contacts in Michigan, for example, as well as mine in Minnesota, you'll see we do have some clusters. For example, we had a large number of people participate in Michigan, so many of our results do reflect some Michigander perspectives that you'll hear as well throughout the talk today. For our study design, so I mentioned that baseline survey that went out in April and May of 2020. We also have done monthly follow-up surveys for a year. So we wanted to check in with everyone to see what are your ongoing experiences? How is your health being affected, both your physical health as well as mental and social health? So how are you feeling about, do you have social contacts? Are you feeling lonely? Are you feeling anxious? And how is, are you exercising? Are you drinking more or less alcohol? We've asked a lot of questions with the, people have also just been really generous in giving responses as well in open-ended questions as well. So not just kind of clicking boxes to respond to set questions with set responses, but we also have open-ended text parts where people can write about their experiences. And that's what we'll focus on today is those open-ended qualitative questions. We also wanted to do some interviews. So in May and July of 2020, we conducted telephone interviews with a random subsample of about 60 people, just to check in again a year later and see how people's experiences were and to learn more about their perspectives and lives. And now we're conducting annual follow-up surveys. So we're actually in the field right now. We contacted everyone 2 years later from our baseline just to check in again. And we hope to do that on an annual basis to see how people are doing over time, because we know that this, well, we're not out of the pandemic yet by any means, and this continues to have multiple effects upon our personal lives as well as the health and well-being of ourselves and our communities. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on one in-depth survey question that we asked. And this was really to give people space to share a lot more about their lives and their perspectives, what they were living through, and kind of how they were making sense of and dealing with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So today we're going to focus on an open-ended question that we asked about grief and loss. And so what we asked, I'm just going to move our faces so I can see this. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues, is there anything that you are grieving, mourning the loss of, or sad about? This may be concrete things such as losing a loved one, job, community or family role, or daily routine, or more ambiguous, such as losing a sense of control, stillness at home, or belief that we can protect our family members? Please describe below. So this is the question that we asked in the survey for people to take a moment to reflect on. And what I'd like for you all to do now is just take 30 seconds or a minute to think about how would you respond to this question? So I'm going to give us 30 seconds. Think about how you would respond. And if you feel comfortable, Tara and I welcome you to respond with some of the things that come to mind in the chat box. So if you feel comfortable sharing, we'd love to hear what you're thinking about in response to this question, but no pressure. This is a very personal, intimate question. So feel free as well as just sit and reflect on your own experiences of grief and loss through the COVID-19 pandemic.
I love it. People are chiming in. Oh my goodness, it's so great. And it's so consistent with what we saw, not being able to see family, grandchildren, friends. We got to use Zoom, but like pros and cons to that, right? I don't know about you, but my eyes start to glaze over at a certain point. That loss of control. Yeah. 2 years of interaction with grandchildren, impact on our grandchildren and future generations. Yeah.
Yeah, these are great responses. Thank you all for sharing. This is a very intimate topic. So thank you for putting your responses in the chat box. It is really, we can't get to them all right now, but I think that I know I'll be looking through these responses and seeing how everyone is responding to this as we continue to experience this all together. I'm seeing things like canceling events, not being able to mourn family or friends collectively through funerals. Again, a lot of not being able to see family members, both older and younger members of your family.
Yeah, that loss of community, something that definitely came up in our study responses too, especially caring for someone with dementia, not being able to visit them and having them not understand why we weren't able to see them.
Yeah, and then I'm also seeing some themes in these responses too of the ease was lost, of being able to just go around in the world and not feel stressed, be able to see a smile behind him. It's hard to see behind a mask. Again, these are themes that you're going to see, I think, reflected in our results as well. So I'm going to move forward, but if you continue to have ideas, again, we welcome you to use the chat box if you want to share additional thoughts that come to mind as we move through this talk. So I'll just quickly tell you what the responses were that we received. So this data we collected responses between May and July of 2020. So this is a little bit older data now, but I think what's interesting to me is that so many of the responses still resonate today, almost 2 years later. And so the data was collected in 2020, and of the 2,587 participants who completed the survey, 85%, so just over 2,000, wrote a response to this open-ended grief and loss question. And many of the responses were quite lengthy. A few people did share just a few words, but many of them, I know Tamara and I spent a lot of time reading and rereading all of these responses. They were incredibly rich and nuanced. People kind of wrote it almost like a journal style, sharing their thoughts and experiences with us. And so what we did together was we thematically analyzed the data. So we didn't come in with preconceived notions of what we were, we weren't testing a hypothesis. We weren't, expecting to confirm or deny some pre-held assumptions. We took kind of a grounded approach, an inductive approach where we let people tell us what mattered to them, what they were thinking about for grief and loss. And that is how we kind of formulated the results without preconceived notions that we were trying to test. And so what we did was we kind of familiarized ourselves with the data. We came up with initial codes that were kind of themes that were coming across strongly in responses. And then we began to search for those themes and kind of systematically code the data. So kind of like virtual highlighting to see how are people responding to this question. And then we reviewed these themes and kind of came up with a structure to name them and wrote them up in a paper that we'll share the link to as well. Our respondents, just so you get a sense of who's answering these questions, of the 2,200, everyone that responded on average was 67 years old. It was almost 3/4 female of our respondents and 28% male. And it was also a heavily white population. So I do want to note that we didn't have strong representation from other underrepresented communities. So it was 94% white among our respondents, as well as 2% Black, 1% Asian, 2% identified as a different race or ethnicity, 2% two or more, and 2% identified as Hispanic. For education, again, this was a fairly skewed, highly educated sample. So just over half did have a graduate school degree and 32% had a college degree. For employment, we had just over half were retired at 54%, 40% were unemployed, and 6% were unemployed and seeking work. Over a quarter of our respondents, 27%, lived alone, and 2/3 were married or in a relationship. 16% were divorced or separated, 8% never married, and 9% were widowed. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tamara, who's going to speak about the results.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, everyone who is sharing in the chat your responses. I would imagine you're going to find a lot of validation in what we're about to talk about, and maybe even you participated in this study. So as Jessica explained, we went into this without any preconceived notions that we were like, we're going to find information about this. We were just, what's there? And I really like doing qualitative research. I like to approach it kind of similarly to how I do my work as a clinician, as a therapist, is with curiosity and compassion. And going into it, really wanting to learn about the experiences of the people that I'm working with. And so what we kind of bore out was about 13 overarching themes that really highlighted this multifaceted, complex nature of grief. And, even in your comments that are coming in the chat, you all are very well aware of the complex nature of grief and how we've experienced it in the pandemic. And we did this study. We didn't know it was going to be early in the pandemic. We didn't know we were going to still be here doing this 2 years later, right? And so I think things have kind of calmed a bit and also been exacerbated a bit over the course of time. And that is the link to the publication. It is open access. And we have the link again later in the presentation. So what I'm going to do is go through each of the 13 themes and then kind of dig in a little deeper on about 4 of them that were really common, with some quotes to kind of show what came up for people there. And I'm going to be able to click. Yes. Okay. So these were the 13 themes. I kind of just wanted to show you them all at once because you're not going to just remember everything that I say next. They are in alphabetical order, not in order of frequency or importance or anything like that. They're just in alphabetical order. And then the ones with the stars are the ones that I'm going to go into a little bit more depth as I describe them. So I think everything that showed up in the chat fits into one of these themes in a way, though there is overlap, of course, and absolutely a lot of complexity to all of them. But everyone touched on something was canceled. We weren't able to have a birthday party. We weren't able to attend a wedding, fear of infecting a parent and then feeling guilty that you didn't get COVID, so you wouldn't have infected them. It's so complex. Everyone talked about feeling a lack of control. We like to have control in our lives. It's something I talk about with clients all the time, is how we can have agency and influence over our lives and our environment. So these are the 13 themes that kind of we've fleshed out in our analysis, and I'm going to go into each of them now. So anticipatory grief. So if you are familiar with the concept of anticipatory grief, in a very simplified fashion, it's grieving something that hasn't happened yet. And to a certain extent, and I work on this with clients, it may or may not happen. We don't know for sure. So I work with a lot of people, for example, that are caring for someone with memory loss. And so we will grieve, what does late stage dementia look like? Oh, we may never experience that. They might pass before that happens, et cetera. Or kind of like when we know somebody is going to die of cancer, we know they're going to lose the ability to walk potentially, or the ability to speak potentially, depending on how things go. And so we're anticipating a future loss. And we saw that come up a few different ways in this study. So people were talking about really this overarching fear or dread of a possible future loss. What does the future hold? Anticipating their own mortality, that sense of I have limited time left and this is how I'm spending it. There you go. See, read my own mind, having that limited time left, right? So kind of being in the moment, but being grieving a future experience. Future losses in one's community, programs going away, the potential for funding to end. What is normal? What kind of relationships will I have with my neighbors after this? Really a big theme of that unknown of the future. What does the future look like? Will life ever be the same? And I think about it too, we're almost exactly 2 years after this study really kind of hit the ground running. Life still isn't the same, and so we still have that possibility of what is life going to be like when this is done, whatever that means exactly. So there's still that unknown, what the world might look like with the future of the virus that hasn't gone away. And so what does that look like as we continue living? And the possibility of never seeing someone again. People touched on fractured relationships due to masking. We didn't have vaccines yet at this time, so we didn't even have the ability to have conflict over that. People were concerned about someone dying and not being able to see them because they weren't traveling. So the possibility of never seeing someone again for a variety of reasons. A lot of people talked about those canceled plans, missed milestones. People were bringing that up a lot in the chat this morning too. So those missed personal events, significant birthdays, anniversaries. People in the study talked about, we were going to go to Italy for our 50th anniversary trip. That had to get canceled. We don't know if we'll ever get to go. Missed milestones of others. So those graduations, those weddings, grandchildren that you may still have not met at this point, possibly as well. Having plans in limbo, really uncertainty, right, about things that were going to happen in the future. A lot of people spoke to having travel delayed or canceled, being retired and being excited about planning some trips and doing trips of a lifetime that you'd had planned for a long time, and they are delayed or maybe never going to happen. People also talked about the concern of the health of other people, of course. And so there was concern for family members. We kind of sussed out a little bit of people who were living in residential long-term care, so assisted living, nursing homes, et cetera, or not. There were kind of a little bit of different themes throughout that as well. Sometimes folks living in condo buildings, you could still see them, but if they were in an assisted living, it might have been on lockdown, right? And so you might not have been able to see your family. Or if you were living in an assisted living, you might not have been able to see your family too. Concern about friends' health, concerns about friends who had cancer and they might get the virus. What would that look like? And then a broader concern about the community and the world. How is this impacting the world? What is happening? There was a lot of concern about people who were homeless or people who had less resources. How are they going to get help if they need help as this continues on? What is happening in my community? What's happening for my neighbors? There was a theme, and it came out in the chat again this morning too, of that loss of contact and connection. So feeling isolated, feeling lonely. Some folks in the study spoke to feeling lonely before the pandemic happened, and so they were used to it. And some spoke to feeling lonely before and that it got worse, right? So everyone's experience is unique, but feeling isolated, feeling like I can't even go to the grocery store. Having a reduced or altered quality of connection, right? Not being able to hug, not being able to hold hands, not being able to see people in person. And so, yeah, we have Zoom, we have FaceTime. It's not the same, right? It gets us through, but getting through is not usually our goal. So having that reduced quality of what the connection looks like when we have different contact. People talked about relationship issues. So some people spoke to having too much time with their spouse, or concern about their adult child having too much time with an abusive father, having connection issues with siblings across the country or people that they were having conflict with over, is the virus real? That sort of thing. That inability to see family and friends, that ability to have the contact that we're used to. We are social creatures as humans. And so being unable to see people in the same way in person usually is our preference, of course, but phone calls and Zoom, they do the trick for a little while. Daily life and routines. So there we are at the asterisk. So this is what I'm going to dig in a little bit more on. So people talked about missed activities, and people were bringing this up in the chat too. The inability to go to choir, the inability to volunteer, to do things that bring us meaning. And so activities in the community, activities that you do independently, but not feeling safe to do them. A huge sense of altered or lost routine. My days have no structure now. I used to go to work. I've chosen to retire early, sort of chosen. And we have a different section on work that we'll get to that touches on retirement as well. But just kind of the structure of the day being changed when you can't go to church. We couldn't physically go to church a lot of times at this point in the pandemic, right? So I think that's also something to kind of remember as we're going through these themes. This was May 2020. And so we were very early in the pandemic. We didn't know what exactly was going to transpire. And a lot of places still had a lot of restrictions. And so there was some participants spoke of, the inability to go to support groups, the inability to go to AA, cancer support groups. So they already had something significant going on in their life, and now they're not able to get the support about that. A lot of frustration, sadness, being trapped at home without a schedule and those regular opportunities to go to the gym or to go to the library, to have those social and mental connections and well-being. All of the names are pseudonyms, but the ages are accurate. And so Teresa said, the structure of my life is gone. It's gone. And so kind of what do we do with that, right? How have we, thinking for ourselves too, of just, I'm sure this has impacted your daily life and routine. It certainly did for me too. And so what have you done over the course of the last 2 years now to restructure your life or form a different routine? Of course, death and bereavement, absolutely. And so we had people who had lost someone to COVID and people who had lost someone to something other than COVID. And so, of course, we will touch on this. And one of the big, I feel like, takeaways from our study and our paper is grief is so broad. It is so broad. It's not just about death. There are so many losses. And so people spoke to their experiences of COVID-19 deaths and not being able to visit people in the hospital, of how to mourn that loss when you couldn't have a funeral. I'm still working with clients who weren't able to have funerals. And, there are ways to do memorials, there are ways to do rituals on the anniversary of a death and down the road as well, and to have the funeral that you weren't able to have initially. But it does kind of complicate things when you're not able to have a traditional, whatever that means to you, ritual and gathering closer to the time of death. And it's tricky for people who weren't able to see their person before they died because they were isolated in a unit by themselves and having a lot of guilt and sadness and pain around them dying alone. And then people talked about as well deaths that were not related to COVID-19 but were impacted by it. Some people had lost someone months prior and talked about, I'm so glad that they weren't here to experience this. That's tricky, right? That is a tricky, complex feeling. And so people spoke to, still not being able to see their person, especially because of this timeline where we were in May 2020. Most residential long-term care settings were still having significant restrictions. And so people not able to see their person before they died. Still not able to have funerals, right? Regardless of the cause of death, we were still not able to have the same funerals and memorials and rituals we would want to have. And another piece that people commented on, which we thought was really important to include, was the loss of pets. We have really, in the last probably 10 years, come to finally understand the significance of pets and pet loss It used to be more of what we call like a disenfranchised grief experience, where society doesn't really acknowledge it or sanction it. It's like, oh, it's just a dog. And it's like, for some people, and people spoke to this too, and people in my work absolutely speak to it. Sometimes pets are more important to us than family. Sometimes our families are complicated. And so people spoke to loss of pets, particularly at this point, that they had to stay out of the veterinary office, and veterinarians not coming into the home to do euthanasia. And so they had to bring the, have the pet brought in from the parking lot, and they had to stay in the parking lot, and how challenging that is to not be with your pet at their time of loss. And so that was something that was really striking as well. And here are some quotes that kind of speak to those things. So Anne mentioned that her sister died in April from the virus. She hadn't seen her in years and didn't get a chance to see her before she died. We always think we have more time. We don't always have more time. Gloria said she had a lot of survivor guilt about hearing deaths in her age group, but that she wasn't impacted personally by that, and that younger adults with families were experiencing deaths due to COVID. And she had survivor guilt about that. And then Dorothy kind of spoke to that experience of losing a pet and saying goodbye outside of the clinic. People spoke to concerns about the government and the economy and how the pandemic was impacting that. People were aggrieved by civil rights concerns, injustice, unrest, things going on in their community, impacts on people of color, impacts directly on their community and the rest of the world. There was concern about the economics of the pandemic and recession and how that would affect everything. They were concerned, a lot spoke to an inadequate response and leadership from particularly the federal government at that point, and feeling like things could have been different. So really grieving kind of the lack of infrastructure to support people who needed it. And kind of, I think, the lack of a sense of safety that services or that infrastructure can provide. So that inadequate response and leadership. But I answered the next question already, that infrastructure and systems were lacking as well. They also spoke to concerns about the media and the internet and kind of how the pandemic was being portrayed, and some misinformation that was going around, and grieving family members who were spreading misinformation, and how their relationships had changed or their respect for them had changed. A loss of agency, absolutely. So feeling like your freedom and independence were altered, at best, removed, at least for a lot of people as well. Feeling like their ability to have ease in their days, and people were speaking to that this morning as well. So having that kind of ease of movement, ease of life, the freedom to go where you want, when you want, which includes travel too, right? Not just the day-to-day stuff. This is where that loss of a sense of control over your life, and also feeling helpless to change things in your own life. And then people talked about feeling unable to help other people. My mom lives across the country. My parents are in Canada. They live in a residence where I'm not allowed. I don't know how to help them. Feeling unsure of how to help our friends or community members. What kind of influence can we have from afar? How do we change things that feel unchangeable? That loss of physical intimacy. Yeah, people talked about that in the chat this morning too. So that inability to hug, kiss, shake hands, or be close to others. We were really still in that thick in the social distancing guidelines and restrictions at the time of this data was gathered. And so being unable to do those human connection pieces. We thought it was really, there was a strong theme of this that went beyond the contact and connection piece, and really was its own standalone theme that came up quite often, was the inability to have the physical intimacy that we're used to. And also some fear about what the future looks like of hugs, of shaking hands. Are we going to be elbow bumping for the rest of time? I know when I just shook someone's hand when I met them the other day, and I was like, am I supposed to be doing this? I can't remember what I'm supposed to be doing. And it felt a little strange. And so I was like, do I wash my hand now? Kind of that uncertainty, right? It's everywhere. That lost sense of normal. And we put it in quotes because what is normal? I mean, that's a bigger philosophical question, but everyone's normal is different. And so normal. So yeah, so that lost ease of just like normal everyday life, right? Like sometimes everyday life can feel humdrum. And I think now for some of us, we're like, that felt okay, actually. I wouldn't mind having that again. And so that inability for people, that inability to be in crowded spaces without worrying, right? The inability to go to the market, to go to an art fair, right? That now they're starting back up again. We have some coming up in Minneapolis next week, and I'm like, no, I'm gonna go. Yes, I'm going to go, and I probably will still wear a mask, but I'm going to go. They were canceled 2 years ago, right? And so kind of thinking about that inability to be in those crowded spaces, including hospitals, right? People were delaying treatments. Treatments were being canceled. Surgeries were being canceled. So that inability to be in what might feel like a crowded space without worrying. Just that lost sense of normal overall, right? The kind of the larger idea of like, what was day to day? What was something I could do without thinking about it necessarily? And that sadness that the world will never be the same, that normal as we knew it may never happen again. There was a strong felt sense of that. And then a sense of safety feeling diminished, that normal sense of safety. Obviously there's overlap. You can see throughout all of these themes, there is overlap through them as well. So feeling like you're being in a constant state of uncertainty and vulnerability. For a lot of people that might be different now 2 years later to some extent, but there's still uncertainty. Cases are rising, right? We hear it every day, and then they're going down, and then we need to wear masks again. Like it's just still very tenuous. And so we've lived for a very long time in a state of tenuousness. And like that's very hard for our nervous systems. It's very hard for our psyche to live in such a state of uncertainty for so long. Couple people spoke to, just kind of highlighting some words from folks. Patty said that lack of spontaneity in life. I can't just do things on a whim. I have to put thought into it. I have to think about the safety of myself and others, and kind of calculate, is it worth it? Should I go to this thing? Marcia said, a loss of control, an opportunity to be carefree. Sad that things might not go back to normal, and people will be less trusting of others, and then there might be attitudes that divide us further. So that the normal as we knew it might never come back, and that our new normal, which is a statement that most people find annoying, might not be great, right? And so obviously some of this has sussed out a little bit in the last couple of years, but we're still, I don't know if we still know what normal will look like. People had concerns. I swear we're toward the end here. This is the 11th of 13. People had concerns about personal health and wellness. So people spoke about access to healthcare, services and support. Some people spoke to surgeries being put off, treatments being put off, fear of going to the doctor, not having access to the things that they would normally have access to keep up their personal health and wellness. So they were talking about their personal physical health concerns as well as personal mental health concerns, feeling more depressed than they were previously, not knowing if they should seek services, what that looks like, lack of accessibility to services as well, not being able to tend to their overall wellness. Like even if there wasn't an illness that they were concerned about, not being able to go to the gym, not being able to walk around your community and feel safe because we didn't know how airborne it was at that time, right? We were still, at least I was still wiping down my groceries, etc. So much has changed over the course of time. There was a sense of grief about social and civic cohesion. There was a sense of grieving the people around us being self-centered and really only concerned about themselves and their desires and their desire for freedom, as it were, feeling a lack of civic cohesiveness. Why aren't we working together on this? Why aren't we coming together on this global concern? And really a concern about the suffering and deaths of those less privileged, people who maybe don't have access to a car to get to the hospital, maybe who don't have a home, and are more likely to be on a public bus for longer durations of time and have more, what is the word I'm looking for, vulnerabilities to possibly getting sick from COVID-19. And work and finances. So people talked about grieving the loss of closing their own business earlier than they wanted to, or they weren't planning on it at all. And the economy changed so much that they had no choice, or just overall being financially impacted by the pandemic, watching their retirement accounts go down. Concerns about their personal finances. What does the future hold? Will I be able to retire in the future? How does this impact our savings accounts? Will I have future work? People spoke to being laid off and wondering, a lot of places, we already live in an ageist society, and so having a hard time thinking about finding future work for this particular population, feeling a lack of support from their workplace. We really were thrown into working from home at that point if we could, but kind of mixed support from our workplaces, grieving that lack of support. Also grieving not being able to, the other piece of that support from the workplace is not being able to connect with our coworkers. Some teachers spoke to not being able to see their students, not being able to buzz around campus in the same way. So that support of not just from the employer, but from coworkers and colleagues. Lost worker employment, right? So being laid off, being kind of forced into retirement early because your role ended, or structural things like that. Grieving the loss of that work structure, routine, purpose, stimulation, right? And we can grieve that when we're retiring outside of a pandemic. Absolutely, we grieve that. And so even more so when it wasn't necessarily a choice. And we as humans like to have choice. It's completely understandable. And so people talked about grieving the lack of a structured day, getting up and going to work, feeling like they had no purpose, feeling like they weren't stimulated. What will they do now that they don't have work? And really struggles working from home. Grieving the ability to have that structure and have that infrastructure as well. So having those altered work patterns, figuring out what is work-life balance. I think we all struggle to figure that out all the time. But when people are not used to working from home, now being forced to work from home, what does that look like? Do you set up a different office? Do you have to buy a bunch of furniture? Do you have to set up a little room divider because you don't have another room? What does that look like? And Raymond spoke to, I've at least temporarily lost 2 types of part-time employment. The money is not particularly important, but I miss the variety, the social connection, and the meaning that it brought to my days. So those are our themes that came out of the data. This is the paper that we wrote. It again is open access. So that is the title and the link if you are interested to read more about it. It goes into greater depth about all of these pieces.
Thanks, Tamara. That was great. And maybe one thing I'll note too that we go into in more depth in the paper is that something about the freedom and control and community cohesion. The majority of our participants were perhaps moderate or left-leaning, but we did also have some who were further in a different political spectrum, and they talked about frustrations over masking and being told what to do and where to go. And so something that's maybe distinct about this survey is that we did have very diverse political spectrum participants who expressed kind of divergent views too, and showed some of the complexities of our pandemic experiences that we go into in more depth in the paper. So we can share that link as well for anyone who wants to learn more. And now we really want to take a moment to pause to think about and hear about what are your reactions to these results? Are they validating of your experiences and perspectives? Are there any surprises that came out that you weren't thinking, that you hadn't thought about before? Is there anything that you want to add to what we shared? How might responses be different now, 2 years later, as to when these were collected, and what has maybe improved in our experiences versus what has become even more challenging. So again, we're going to try very hard to be quiet for 30 seconds. I'm going to count in my head. and again, if you want to share, we welcome you to share in the chat box. You can do it to just us as the hosts and panelists to see, or you can, I think you should have permissions as well to share to everyone if you would like. And just tell us a little bit about what are your reactions to the results. So really, this is meant to be an ongoing conversation. We're continuing to do more work on this topic. And so this is by no means exhaustive and final. So just would love to hear a little bit about how you're reacting to and thinking about the results that Tamara shared so eloquently. So we'll pause for 15, 30 seconds. And again, feel free to put your responses in the chat, either to us, the hosts and panelists, or to everyone in the group. Okay, so we're seeing some comments about them being validating. We're also seeing some requests for what were the coping strategies. And I should say that a lot of the study, this is the COVID-19 coping study, we have thought a lot about coping strategies, and we presented in our last talk about some of that as well. We entire papers about that. We felt like grief is such a complicated, important and huge topic. We wanted to give the space today to focus on grief itself and the many multifaceted losses that we're experiencing. But there were absolutely ways of coping at both an individual level with personal strategies, as well as broader community actions and events that happen. So that is something we didn't get into today, but we're very much thinking about. Oh my gosh, there's amazing responses coming in. I don't even know how to.
Coming in so rapidly, it's wonderful. Yeah, one of them was talking about wishing we talked about some positives. And I think the thing is this particular topic of grief and the way that the qualitative analysis goes is we shake out what shakes out of the data, and it wasn't particularly positive. But I like kind of like the rest of this comment was kind of focusing on now we had time to do different things. And so they talked about, I sorted 12 boxes of pictures that I'd wanted to organize for years. Now I can find pictures for myself and others. So absolutely were people able to take the time that they had and do different things with it? 100%. And the topic was specifically on grief. And so all of the themes come out of what people had told us, and they didn't really give us a lot of positive pieces. Specifically also, I think, because we were 2 years ago in the very beginning of the pandemic. So we didn't even know we were going to have time to do those positive things. But yeah, absolutely. Are there some positive things that have come out of it? Out of our time? Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the other themes I'm seeing coming in the thread is that things are still confusing, and that is kind of a loss of that control, agency, normalcy that we want, and still not knowing what is safe to do, what is not, when should I take certain behaviors, and that's something that people are writing to us in the chat as well, that has resonated, that is continuing even 2 years later. And then people are also mentioning other sources of grief and loss, for example, the war in Ukraine at this present time, or other events that have happened in the United States, as well as the broader world, that are intersecting the pandemic and these experiences that we're all following and feeling at a very intimate, personal level.
Yeah, a lot of validation, confirmation, concern about the future. Thank you, everyone. Oh my goodness, there's probably 40 responses in here coming so quickly. It's so wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to reflect.
And Tamara and I will both share, save these chats, and we'll take the time to go through them as well, because we do appreciate everyone sharing. And I know we don't have time to go through that, because I'm aware of the time, and we're coming up on the hour. So we will move forward at this point, but just thank you everyone again for these really thoughtful responses in what you're writing in the chat to us. We appreciate it. And with that, I will turn it back to Tamara to briefly kind of discuss some of the implications and and ways for us to all manage our grief.
Yes. So my hope is that this section gets at a couple of the questions that came in the chat about what to do now. Beautiful. So, so that was really kind of like the nitty gritty of the data and the themes that came out. So now I'm just kind of going to talk about a little bit more, zooming out. So there was a sense of ongoing pervasive loss. And again, I think just to keep us in the timeline, it was 2 years ago. We have 2 more years of this that have happened since then, right? So that sense of ongoing pervasive loss, for people who are experiencing that bereavement due to death, that inability to visit their loved one prior to the death or to have those rituals was especially distressing. There were these multifaceted losses. So there's kind of just another term like these tangible losses, such as a job, relationships, travel plans, financial security, the stuff we can see on paper or the stuff that we can physically go and do. And then these intangible losses. So that sense of control, sense of safety, sense of normalcy. People often were vacillating between those immediate here and now losses and those possible future losses. So what plans and goals for themselves and others looked like, what is the future going to look like for our grandkids? People who were particularly older in our population connected their grief to having that sense of a limited amount of time left. And I'm spending my time this way and I'm restricted in this way. Is this meaningful? And really, there's this other concept of having a shattered assumptive world. And if you're interested in this, we go into more of this in the paper, but really we form our assumptive worlds throughout our lives, but they really start when we're young. And it's really based on the expectations about the world around us, that it's predictable, that it's safe, that it's consistent, that we have some control and influence over it. And those were really shattered when the pandemic started and we went, whoa, maybe the world isn't safe. My life is not consistent. I might not have control or influence over it in the same way, and how to deal with that. Again, we talk about it a lot more in the paper. So moving forward, absolutely moving forward. What do we do? So what, right? So now what? So I think it's really important, and I see this in my clinical work as well, but even if you aren't a person who wants to go to therapy or do clinical, experiences, just really recognizing and acknowledging all of the losses that you've experienced. This particular talk is probably not going to be an upper. So let's just call that out, and that's okay too, because life is not an upper. And so we do have some tips toward the end here that'll be helpful too, I hope. But including those losses that maybe feel hidden, such as that quality of connection or yearning for physical touch. Like there's some grief to that too, right? And so kind of like broadening what you think about as grief. How do we create a sense of safety and recovery, both individually and collectively? We are adjusting, I think, to being in more crowded areas without feeling anxious. What are the steps that you can take to feel more safe in different settings? Understanding that COVID re-entry is hard, that re-entry anxiety. There are papers about that and there are interventions for that, right? Of that re-entry anxiety. What will it look like to return to life knowing that it may never be the same, whatever the same was for you? And then I think it's also really important to distinguish between depression and grief. And this is a whole other kettle of fish, but kind of understanding, what was your mental health like before the pandemic? Were you struggling with feelings of depression, experiences of depression before the pandemic? Are you grieving something in particular? Is it something that is acute? Is it something that ebbs and flows? Do you have a sense of hopelessness? And to the extent that you want to, utilizing professionals. We're not that bad, we're not that scary, but kind of there is, for a lot of people, some overlap in their feelings of depression and grief, and there also are ways to differentiate it and different ways to help address those. So hopefully leaving you with some tangible tips to help yourself with grief and loss. These are not earth-shattering. They might just be a nice reminder. There's not a magic potion that has come out of research in the last couple of years that says this is how you do the thing. So like we talked about, really acknowledging all of your losses, acknowledging the fact of the changes that have happened in your life. When we don't allow ourselves to grieve, it comes out. grief demands to be felt. And so it comes out in stomach aches, it comes out in irritability, it comes out in headaches, it comes out in anger, all sorts of directions that grief can come out. So acknowledging them and feeling them, being present to yourself, allowing yourself that time and space to think and feel, and understanding that there is no right way or wrong way to grieve. There are not stages that you go through and then you accept it and it's magical. And so just really giving yourself the time and space to feel what you need to feel, and getting support as necessary. Understanding, like we've talked about, that grief and loss extends far beyond death-related losses, that no loss is greater or lesser important. You get to decide how important your loss is to you. No one else gets to decide that, despite them maybe trying to decide how important something should be to you. It's really up to you to decide that. A lot of people find a lot of help in journaling. I get really nerdy about narrative interventions and writing letters to my past self, to somebody who has died that maybe I didn't get to have a final experience with. There are a lot of ways to connect with people, including our inner children. This might sound kind of woo-woo, but there's a lot of ways to go about in a written way addressing and working through some of your grief and loss, whether that be death or non-death. And people find journaling to be helpful. I knew I would get to it. That letter writing, big fan. Yep. I have clients that are like, I know what you're going to say, Tam. You're going to say, have you thought about writing a letter? And I'm like, yeah, you know what's up my sleeve. And they're like, I hadn't thought about it, but I know I should. Moving forward with your loss, not trying to move on from it. So I could get really geeky about grief research. We know that we don't stop grieving usually, we carry it with us. And so that over the course of time, it might feel less heavy, it might feel less dark, it might feel less weighty, but you move forward rather than moving on from it. We're not going to leave people behind, we carry them with us. And so not pressuring yourself to move on from it, but understanding that you can carry it with you. Of course, obviously talking to trusted friends or family members, I think it's important to differentiate. I hear this with clients all the time. Who do you feel like understands you? There are not always the right people to talk to about things going on in life, right? And so finding people who understand and validate your loss, and don't say like, get over it, Barbara, time to move on. It's been 2 years, come on. That's not helpful. I don't know about you, but it's never been helpful to me when someone's like, just get over it. Like, that's not really how it works. And then of course, talking to a counselor or therapist, getting in a support group to have that non-judgmental, neutral listening ear, or be surrounded by people who understand because they've experienced it too. And then finally, just some tips to help others with grief and loss. I think being fully present to them, setting down the phone, that silence is okay. We can get really freaked out with silence, but just presence, right? If you feel safe to be in person again, that presence, I don't know about you, but being with people again has been so helpful. And so just being with somebody when they've experienced a loss, or they are actively experiencing a loss, understanding that you don't necessarily need to be jibber jabbering all the time, and they don't necessarily need to be talking either. Getting them to talk might not be the solution. You can invite it, but not expect it, which is related to this as well. Not trying to fix it, because you can't. You can't usually undo the loss or fix it. And so we like to try to think that we can kind of take pain away from people and we can be there with them, but we can't really take it away from them. Not judging how they're grieving or how fast they're grieving, including for yourself, right? How you're grieving, how fast you're grieving, but for others, understanding that everyone's completely different. A lack of tears doesn't mean someone's not grieving. They process different. That's okay. People don't need to be bawling to be grieving. Offering specific things. So offering to bring over cooked meals, to go on a walk, to help them with laundry. It can be really overwhelming. This is true for, any setting, like somebody dealing with chronic or terminal illness, or someone who's grieving, etc. It can be really overwhelming to have to ask for help. So that, like, call me if you need me. Why don't you just call them? Let me know if you need anything. Why don't you offer? Like, sometimes people have a very hard time in it. Midwestern, like, I don't want to be a burden, right? And so I'm not going to ask. Just offer, like, hey, I'm going to bring you over your favorite tacos. I'm going to just leave them on your doorstep. I hope you like them. And remembering this loss is their loss. We don't get to decide what's meaningful for another person. They don't get to decide what's meaningful for us, but we can love other people when they're hurting.
Perfect. Thank you, Tamara. That was really helpful to listen to and just a great refresher. I think that for sake of time, we'll maybe move forward. But if you also want to think about or share with us in the chat, is there anything else that's been helpful for you when you've been grieving? We also welcome hearing your perspectives, but we are, we want to have time for your questions as well. So I'm going to move forward at this point, but again, welcome any thoughts in the chat about things that you have found helpful when you are grieving or supporting others who are grieving. Feel free to share them with us. So just like taking a look at the future, what are we up to? So this is, as I said, an ongoing process, an ongoing discussion and learning experience, I think, for me and Tamara. So we continue to write papers about we collected a lot of data on really different and diverse topics, and the pandemic has had many multifaceted impacts on our lives. And so we continue to write those up in papers and also try to share those findings in talks like these. So giving public talks, talking to media outlets, radio, newspaper, television, just trying to share what we're learning with the broader world so that we can make it accessible and try to kind of enact change through that. We also have a study website and a newsletter that we try to, at the moment, we're both Lindsay and I both have small children. So we're trying to do the newsletter quarterly given our busy schedules. But we have on our website, I'll put the link later. I can put it in the chat and email it out as well. We do have a study newsletter that we send out, and you can sign up through our website if you want to stay up to date with some of our findings and what we're thinking about and working on. And then, of course, one of the ultimate goals of this as well is to kind of give evidence and help inform upstream broader changes and interventions and actions. So trying to inform policymaking. So for example, in the case of the grief paper, at the end, we do provide suggestions on ways that we might have more formal structures and supports for mental health services and counseling and other ways to help all of us who are going through grieving processes, particularly particular older adults who may be more vulnerable to experiencing different losses throughout this time. So lots that we're working on, and we welcome you to stay in touch through our newsletter as well as through emails. Just a quick thank you as we wrap up. So we have many study team members who've been involved in this process and working with us on analyzing data, sending out newsletters, et cetera. And of course, the study participants, a heartfelt thank you. If anyone listening is part of the study, thank you. We have just been overwhelmed by the amazing and generous responses everyone gives, the time that you've all taken to share with us, including over time. And we have people answering responses monthly to us, now yearly. And it's just amazing the generosity that you've all shared to help us make these findings more broadly available to our communities and our policymakers and our friends as well. So with that, I've put our information on the slide, but again, we'll try and send out this information by email so you have it, and we welcome any questions and thoughts that you might have. Thank you all so much for being engaged with us over the past hour. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, ladies. That was really good. If you want to, you could unshare your slides now if you wish. A couple things. One thing I wanted to mention to the viewers is that you will get a copy of this presentation today in an email. So I guess I would suggest to whoever's going to do that to add the link to your paper in that email too. That would be useful, right? So I think that's Minyan is going to do that today. So add the link to their paper. Is that a paper that's viewable by the public, or do you have to have a...
Yes, the paper is, so if you have the link, anyone can read the full paper.
Okay.
We make sure that it's publicly available and open access.
Okay, great. That's great. And then a week from today, the audience will be able to see a video, the recording. It takes a week to get it processed, but a week from today, they'll be able to see the recording as well. And I also note next week, I believe it's Tamara is on again talking about coping. Do you want to say just a few words about that? Because that sounds like...
Sure. Yeah, so when we initially booked that talk probably 6 months ago, it was envisioned that it would be a facilitated discussion, and then 1,000 people RSVP'd. And so the organizers contacted me and said, maybe not that. And so the title is actually changed. It's going to be, I'm going to remember it off the top of my head, Coping with Chronic and Terminal Illness as We Age, Steps for Cultivating Resilience, I believe is what it is. So it'll be more of kind of like it was today, an hour-ish talk and then 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you want to hear my voice a lot more, I will be talking for an hour next Friday.
Okay, well, I think people would look forward to that. Thank you. I think it'd be useful, actually, at this point. I'll get to the Q&A, and oh, by the way, to the viewers, please put your remaining questions in the Q&A and not in the chat box, if you would. But some people wrote in some very nice suggestions of what helped them. So, ladies, why don't you go ahead and review those in the chat box for just a minute, okay? I think that'd be nice.
Yeah, I was really struck by what people were saying too, that time and space to work through your grief in your own way, keeping a person who died in your heart. My first husband died 30 years ago of cancer. I'm happily remarried, but my first husband is always with me. Being in nature, listening to music, writing stories, creating an archive.
Yeah, there were some good suggestions. Go ahead, Jessica.
I was just gonna say, we have heard a lot about being outdoors, and that how it can help your physical health to be outside, to move your body, whether it's walking, running, biking, sitting with grandchildren in a park. But it's also the physical, the mental and social health as well. We've heard a lot about, this was one of the few places people felt safe to be outside, and parks stayed open when many places shut down in more urban and suburban areas. So we've heard a lot about how going outside, having that daily goal of just get out the door. Doesn't matter what you do or for how long, but just get your foot out the door. People talked about how that has helped them, and they found joy, whether it is a large-scale gardening project, or a farm area you live near on, or as small as a potted plant on a windowsill. Some of our participants are largely bedbound and don't have the ability to get outside, but they're still finding ways to have contact therapeutically with nature through these more intimate, small-scale activities. And we do have a separate paper I can put in the email as well about coping strategies, completely devoted to the ways people tried to cope in the early days of the pandemic. And we're now doing some analyses to do ways of coping later in the pandemic and how this may have shifted over time.
Okay, I'll go ahead and I'll get to the Q&A, the ones in the Q&A box now. I'll present them to you. What responsibility do elderly people have in preparing their friends and families for their eventual disability and demise, i.e. remember me but don't grieve? Would you care to comment on that?
I mean, I maybe have a unique view of that, of like, I don't know if I would use the word responsibility necessarily. I think it is helpful, but I know I end up in my clinical work often being a facilitator of those hard conversations about end-of-life decision-making, because there's always something more pleasant to talk about than talking about those decisions. And I know even for myself, my parents are older, and I had to force them nicely to prepare for their own decision making and kind of communicate to my brother and I what those decisions were. So I think it's sort of a shared responsibility in a way. I think we as adult children are responsible for also asking the questions so that we can be prepared for what the future might hold, and also that the older adults themselves are also kind of sharing that responsibility of preparing and talking about it too. But I mean, we just don't want to. We still live in a death denying society. We still don't want to talk about it. And so I think we're moving in the right direction. But I do think that is absolutely an area of challenge for families, and often why I get brought in to have those hard conversations and help them bring up the hospice word and resuscitation and things that people don't want to talk about.
Jim, you're muted.
I know. It's only been 2 years. With Zoom and online contacts, have we changed the makeup of our daily contacts and interactions? Are we corresponding with people from our past more that we wouldn't have interacted with face to face?
I can maybe start for this one, Tamara, if that's right. Yeah, the answer is yes, for most of us. We are seeing Some participants in other questions have wrote to us about how their worlds have opened up because they're able to connect with family and friends and communities across the country, across the state, across the world, and trying to build those connections. But many also in the same breath do say that they're not necessarily a full replacement. So they're finding areas of growth and opportunity to connect with people in different ways, but it's not necessarily, we had that whole theme on physical intimacy. You can't, people over into us, you can't give a hug through Zoom. You can give verbal affirmations and love and connection in different ways, but a lot of us yearn for the physical touch of hugging a grandchild and kissing those squishy baby cheeks, or there's levels of contact and connection and care that can't be fully captured through online context. So there's areas where we're hearing both of those experiences and responses, that there are areas for growth and connection, but online is not necessarily a full replacement. And there's also some broader comments about how when we're online, this is maybe a broader commentary on our society, but we've had some really interesting responses too about how online may kind of contribute to further siloing of who we talk to and who we're in connection with. So people talk about how they have great maybe Facebook groups or online forums or Nextdoor, but it's not necessarily those casual encounters over bumping into someone at over the celery at your grocery store and having that conversation, or sitting next to someone at a restaurant and having an impromptu. Just the other day, I was out on a patio and it felt so good, and I heard an older man striking up a conversation with the young couple there. So the online is those purposeful planned interactions, but people write to us about how we're losing kind of that civic cohesion, that kind of the different people we come into contact with, unplanned familiar strangers in our community, that how important those connections are that we lose when we're kind of online only and more in kind of these home environments.
Yeah, I've seen that too. I had a meditation group that met in person, and we go to Panera's afterwards to visit. And there's such a difference between just sitting next to a person over a coffee and talking spontaneously versus now we do it on Zoom and you're staring at these people that are with their eyes closed. But after you're done, we visit, and it's a different thing. And in fact, I'm guessing there's a whole new research field on how humans really communicate. With the body language, the eye contact. Eye contact is different on Zoom if it's there at all. There's a whole difference there.
Yeah.
Here's a question: were retired folks much less affected by the disruptions of COVID than working age families with jobs and of course people with kids? That must have been a traumatic experience, I would think.
I'll start if that's okay. I don't think so. I think it was different. And I think there was a really neat contribution in the chat from someone. They had said the quote, "Comparison is the thief of compassion." And I think that actually kind of comes into play here. And so what do we know about some of the losses that people at retirement age experienced? Well, a lot of the folks that have died from COVID, especially early on, were older. And so older folks have borne the brunt of COVID-related deaths. And it's also that age group that experiences more deaths overall due to age and decline. And so the work loss, that sort of thing, absolutely working age families had disruptions with school, absolutely still had deaths, had parents that were dying, had daycare that was closing, changes in employment. So I guess I would say not necessarily to compare, because I don't know to what extent that's helpful, probably usually not. Or it's a thief of compassion as well. And so, but that they were different. They were different losses, different stressors, different changes that different populations had to deal with, but that all were very challenging and in different scope and in different depth and expression, but that everyone across the board has experienced it. Significant loss and significant challenges.
That brings up a point. I mean, the U.S. has exceeded 1 million people recently, but I haven't seen a breakdown from a socioeconomic breakdown, but it seemed to me, based on the news we were getting for the past 2+ years, that it wasn't equally distributed across the population, that the poor and disenfranchised suffered more than those who were not. Could you comment on that? And I mean, in your survey, how did that break out there? Did you have a way of looking at that?
Yeah, I can speak to this briefly. We are seeing that underrepresented and underserved communities are harder hit by the pandemic. There is a whole host of reasons for it. For example, we know physical living conditions are different. So lower income housing is more crowded. You don't necessarily have private space to work, to have a even outdoor space. Private indoor space, outdoor space is not necessarily, that's a luxury that not everyone has. So like Tamara mentioned as well, needing to use public transit, being more exposed to other people in your workplace. Can you work from home? And I'm in a home office right now versus needing to be in person at work, where there's not necessarily the safe distance between people. So that's just one example of the ways where we see this difference. And we know too that there are, huge differences given systemic racism, systemic classism, sexism. There are huge differences in the physical health of different Americans in our country. And so that causes increased risk to COVID-19 among particular groups. And so absolutely, we're seeing different impacts by communities. And we have in some ways tried to explore this. As I said at the beginning in our study, it is a fairly white, female educated sample. So we are over sampled for more affluent and advantaged groups, but we still do have large components of people in the study who are from underrepresented and underserved communities. The interviews that we did last summer in May or July purposely focused on sampling among racial and ethnic minorities, as well as people with lower education and income. And so in those, I'm just in the process of literally on my other screen is analyzing the responses from adults who are more disadvantaged, to see what are their distinct experiences and how can we develop supports to particularly support those who are hardest hit by the pandemic in terms of kind of their communities being the highest numbers of COVID cases, the numbers of deaths, as well as long COVID symptoms too. We're seeing now there's a lot of research at NIH. They're getting a huge study off the ground to try to understand the lingering and ongoing long-term effects of having a COVID-19 infection. And they're guessing, they don't know yet because there's no data to speak to this yet, but they do think there could be differences in who has those long-term effects from long COVID after an infection.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Did you see a role for a spiritual practice or meditation as a coping, as enhancing the people's ability to cope?
I'll maybe jump in from the study perspective, Tamara, and then feel free to give your professional expertise. For our study respondents, yes, people did talk about meditation and spiritual communities and faith practices as large sources of coping. And that included both individual practices. So people talked about using meditation. Sometimes they would take classes, they would get apps or online courses, or just re-engage with some of those spiritual practices that they found meaningful and helpful to find calming, to find centeredness, to find space. And then at the community perspective for coping too, we know that coping is not just an individual, but it can be a collective process as well. So faith communities, for example, churches and synagogues and temples and mosques were all discussed in our results as large places to collectively support one another, be part of a community. Many wrote about how they appreciated online services when it was necessary to be able to continue to engage with these practices, even from a distance. And even now, 2 years later, we're still seeing some people, given health considerations and other reasons, are not able to go back in person safely. And they appreciate that some places are continuing to offer online services or hybrid activities to continue engaging in those kind of faith and spiritual practices, even if they are not able yet to re-engage in person.
Mm-hmm.
That is consistent with what I've seen with clients too.
Okay. There's one last one here. I think I might have another one to add. The person asks, is grief basically a personal selfish reaction to loss, one that should be abbreviated if possible? Would you care to comment on that?
I would love to comment on that. And I think
But
I
you
can
might.
say, I know I've been itching. I saw that question. I want to say with the most compassionate clarity, no, it's not. It's not a selfish reaction. It is absolutely normal. It is absolutely human to grieve. And the more I see folks trying to abbreviate a grieving experience, like I said, it comes out in other ways. It comes out in physical manifestations of stress. It comes out in irritability to our families. It comes out in really just kind of like we deny our feelings. Grief is a really important human experience that I really think it begs to be felt. It begs to be processed. And everyone's way of going about that is completely different. And so being aware to not pressure yourself or others to have it look a certain way or go a certain speed. Grief is absolutely not selfish at all. It's just so very normal. And it sort of breaks my heart that that's a question, to be honest, because it's just so important to be able to feel what you need to feel and to honor what you have going on in a way that looks and feels appropriate for you. And so if you feel like, nope, I have to buck up and I have to go on with my day, then do that. That's also a way of coping, is to say, like, I have to continue to move forward. But that doesn't mean you stop feeling it. That doesn't mean you say, my loss didn't matter. I need to be over it, right? I need to grin and bear it. It doesn't usually work super well. And so being able to honor the experiences that you're having. If I may, Jim, there's actually a comment in the chat that I'd like to just chime in on just a second.
Please do. Go ahead.
So someone commented on being outdoors. I bought a small raised bed this spring and am planting a few veggies and herbs, which is not a typical activity for me, but draws me outside. And they said, growth is hopeful? That's question mark. Growth is hopeful. And I just think, yes. And I don't know if this person was saying growth like the plants or growth ourselves, growth. Both is hopeful. And I think there's this really important concept of post-traumatic growth. So a lot of us are familiar with post-traumatic stress, and people to varying degrees are speaking to the experiences of the pandemic as being traumatic, which I think we can honor. Everyone's experiences are different. And so this idea of post-traumatic growth, where we are resilient people are resilient. It is something we can build. It is something we can cultivate. This is a plug for my talk next week. But it is not something that's only available to a prized few. It is something that everyone has accessible to them in different ways, and ways that we can cultivate. Growth is absolutely hopeful. Have people grown as a result of their experiences of the pandemic? 100%. Absolutely. There is opportunity everywhere, every day, to grow from our experiences here. And being able to watch plants grow is a wonderful kind of parallel process to be able to envision that as well.
Well, thank you. You know, your research is so incredibly valuable. I mean, it was a crash course that you didn't sign up for. None of us did. But it gave us this giant laboratory to look at people and growing isolation, growing separation, which isn't going to end for us, for the elderly, because that's what happens to us as we age. So hopefully what you're learning here can be extrapolated to the aging population. And thank you for all that you're doing on this. It's so appreciated.
It's our pleasure and privilege to do this work. It is a silver lining for me with the pandemic has been being able to engage with everyone through this study. And I know we've had a few comments come in about requests to access the links. So like Jim said, we'll make sure in the email that goes afterwards, we'll put a link to the grief paper that goes into this in much more depth. And it's open access. So I just click the link and you can see it. And we can put in a link to the study website where we list all of the papers that we've published and other reports that we've done. So we'll make sure that you can get access to this if you want to, and to sign up for the newsletter and just stay in touch with us.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jessica Finley and Tamara Stotts. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for listening today. And tune in again. And remember, you're going to get an email later today with this presentation and the items that Jessica just mentioned. So thank you all, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know.